The year is 1980. The dust is settling on the 1970s, a decade that was really defined by grit, by realism, and by the director as the ultimate authority.
The new Hollywood era.
Exactly. We're talking about the era of Coppola, Scorsese, Altman. But as the calendar turned, the industry underwent a change.
Mm-hmm.
I would argue it was more radical than, say, the transition to sound.
It was a structural revolution.
We were looking at the 1980s, and this isn't just a list of movies. It is an autopsy of that revolution. We are witnessing the death of the auteur and the birth of the corporate blockbuster.
It's a shift from an artistic model to a strictly economic one. The 1980s formalized the business practices that really govern the modern film industry.
So all things we see today.
The strategies for marketing, for distribution, for franchise management, all of that was engineered during this 10-year period.
To really understand this new landscape, we have to understand the philosophy that drove it. In the 70s, you might pitch a movie based on a feeling, maybe a character study, a political statement.
Mm-hmm.
In the 80s, that conversation just stopped. It was replaced by a very specific doctrine. We were talking about the high concept.
High concept is the defining term of the era. It was largely popularized by the producer Don Simpson.
And his influence was huge.
It cannot be overstated. Simpson viewed filmmaking not as an exploration of the human condition, but as the manufacturing of a product. The definition he established was rigid.
Okay, so let's unpack that definition. If I'm a writer in, say, 1983, and I'm walking into a producer's office, what does my idea need to look like to get a green light?
It needs to be immediately graspable. Simpson's criteria were twofold: marketability and clarity.
Sellable and simple?
Right. First, the film must be easily sellable to a mass audience. Think a single image, a single hook. Second, and this is the most important part, the plot must be understandable in 1 or 2 sentences.
Just 1 or 2.
If you have to explain the backstory or the nuance of the character's motivation or the political context, the idea is rejected, out of hand.
It's the elevator pitch in its purest form. You're stripping away all ambiguity. A movie is no longer a complex narrative, it's a sentence. A cop goes to Los Angeles and gets trapped in a building with terrorists.
That is the movie.
That's it.
It streamlined the creative process, but really to serve the marketing department. When a narrative is that simple, it translates universally.
That makes sense. It crosses borders more easily.
It crosses language barriers, cultural divides, much more easily than a dialogue-heavy drama. This method became the standard formula. It wasn't a temporary trend. It was the foundation for the entire global blockbuster economy.
Now, while Hollywood was locking down this formula, calibrating its output for, maximum efficiency, we have to acknowledge that this was a global decade.
Absolutely.
On the other side of the Pacific, the Hong Kong film industry was undergoing its own golden age.
The parallel is significant. While Hollywood was refining the mega picture through budget and marketing, Hong Kong was elevating its international prominence through physical performance and technical innovation in action choreography.
And we will definitely get into that divergence in more detail.
Mm-hmm.
But let's stay on the economics for a moment. We need to dissect the blockbuster model. This is often referred to as the mega picture mentality.
Yes.
In the previous decades, a film might open in a few cities, build word of mouth, and then slowly expand. The 80s killed that slow burn.
The strategy shifted entirely to the opening weekend. The goal was saturation. Studios began focusing their resources on a smaller number of larger films, the so-called mega hits.
Get it all back at once.
The objective was to earn a massive percentage of the total revenue in the first few weeks of release.
This required a change in scheduling. You couldn't just release a movie whenever it was finished. You had to carve out a battlefield.
Precisely. Release dates were chosen strategically to avoid competition. You wanted a clear runway for your blockbuster.
And this is where the idea of the summer blockbuster season really becomes a science.
It solidifies into hard science, yes.
Now, there's a critical debate here. Many critics, and even filmmakers like Quentin Tarantino, they look at this shift and see the death of art. They see it as the moment cinema just became a spreadsheet.
Right.
But is it accurate to say the 1980s invented this mentality?
Not entirely. Film theorist David Bordwell makes a strong case that the mega picture mentality actually began in the 1970s.
With which films?
Specifically with the release of Jaws and Star Wars. The 1980s did not invent the blockbuster, it industrialized it. It took the anomaly of the 70s and turned it into the business plan of the 80s.
Okay, so let's look at the titans that proved this business plan worked. We can't have this conversation without talking about Star Wars. The decade opens with The Empire Strikes Back in May of 1980.
The Empire Strikes Back was a financial juggernaut. It was the highest-grossing film of its year. But beyond the box office, it sustains the highest critical rating of any 80s film on IMDb.
So it was a critical and commercial monster.
It proved that a sequel could equal or even surpass the original in terms of cultural impact.
And the machine didn't stop. Return of the Jedi followed in 1983, concluding the original trilogy. These weren't just movies, they were cultural events.
They were.
But George Lucas wasn't the only architect of this era. He teamed up with Steven Spielberg to revive a genre that had been dead for, 30 years?
The collaboration on Indiana Jones, Raiders of the Lost Ark, released in 1981, is a perfect execution of high concept.
How so?
It revived the 1930s adventure serials. You have cliffhangers, treasure hunting, supernatural elements, all wrapped in a very clear marketable package.
And it starred Harrison Ford. At this point, Ford is the face of the decade. He's Han Solo and Indiana Jones. He effectively cornered the market on the American hero.
He did, and Raiders generated immediate market ripples. It was the highest-grossing film of 1981. It didn't just make money, it spawned imitators.
Like Romancing the Stone.
Romancing the Stone in 1984 was a direct response. The industry saw that audiences had an appetite for this kind of adventure, and they pivoted to supply it.
But if we want to talk about the absolute peak of the 80s box office, the gold standard, we have to talk about The Alien.
E.T. the Extraterrestrial, released in 1982.
The numbers on E.T. are, well, they're difficult to comprehend even by modern standards. We're used to films making $1 billion because of inflation and ticket prices.
Right.
But relative to its competition at the time, E.T. was a monster.
The data is staggering. E.T. earned 40% more than any Star Wars film released in the decade.
40%. That is a massive margin.
To contextualize it further, E.T. earned double, or in some cases, triple the revenue of 46 of the top 50 films of the entire decade.
That is an incredible statistic. It didn't just beat the competition, it lapped them several times over.
It remains the #1 highest-grossing film worldwide for the whole decade. It brought in approximately $792 million.
And when a studio sees a return on investment like that,
It validates the entire high-concept strategy. It confirms that a simple, emotional story with broad, universal appeal is the most valuable asset in the portfolio.
so we had these massive family blockbusters. But there was another energy in the 80s, a more aggressive, violent energy. The 1980s was the decade of action.
Yes.
And not just action, but a specific type of physicality.
The Hollywood hard body.
Exactly. In the 70s, your action hero might have been Gene Hackman or Roy Scheider. They looked like regular people, a bit tired, maybe out of shape, wearing rumpled suits.
In the 80s, the hero became a statue. The muscular action star became the dominant archetype.
This trend was driven by three key figures: Arnold Schwarzenegger, Sylvester Stallone, and Chuck Norris.
Those are the three pillars of the genre for the era.
Let's analyze the Schwarzenegger phenomenon first. Here's a guy who's a bodybuilder. He wasn't an actor in any traditional sense, and yet he became the biggest star in the world.
Schwarzenegger's career was built on utilizing his physique as a special effect. In The Terminator from 1984, his lack of emotional range and his imposing physical size were perfect for the role of a cyborg.
Right, it was a feature, not a bug.
Precisely. In Commando in 85 and Predator in 87, the camera fetishizes the body. The muscles are part of the costume. They signal capability and, more importantly, invulnerability.
Then you have Sylvester Stallone. He took this archetype and applied it to a very specific American wound, the Vietnam War.
The Rambo franchise is historically significant for its revisionism. First Blood from 1982 is a darker, more psychological film. It's about a veteran with PTSD fighting a local sheriff.
It's a much smaller, more contained story.
It is, but the sequels, Rambo, First Blood Part 2, and Rambo the Third, they transform the character completely.
He goes back to Vietnam.
He returns to the jungle. In the 1970s, cinema treated Vietnam as a tragedy or a moral quagmire. In the 80s, through Rambo, Hollywood rewrote the ending.
He gets to win this time.
He goes back and wins. He rescues the PRWs. He defeats the bureaucracy that tied America's hands. It turned a national trauma into a backdrop for superheroics.
Then Chuck Norris did the same thing with the Missing in Action trilogy. Yes. Released in 1984, 1985, and 1988, those films followed the exact same premise. A veteran returning to rescue prisoners of war.
It was a very popular theme.
It resonated with the political climate of the Reagan era, which emphasized reasserting American strengths on the global stage.
But just as this trend of the invincible hero reached its absolute peak, the wheel turned. In 1988, we got a movie that, in many ways, deconstructed the hard body. We got Die Hard.
Die Hard represents a major pivot point. Bruce Willis was not an action star. He was a TV comedy actor from moonlighting.
And his character, John McClane, is not a super soldier. He's barefoot, he's bleeding, he's complaining the whole time.
He is a New York City detective who becomes involved inadvertently. That is the key distinction.
Rambo seeks the fight.
McClane is trapped in it. He is vulnerable. He's fallible. This contrast with the invincible figures of the early 80s set the template for the 1990s action hero.
Now, while American audiences were watching Schwarzenegger flex, audiences in the East were watching something entirely different. The Hong Kong action revolution was in full swing. This was led by Jackie Chan, Tsui Hark, and John Woo. The fundamental difference was in the choreography and the philosophy of movement.
The Western style was about size and firepower. The Hong Kong style was about speed, complexity, and, well, pain.
Yes. The three dragons, Jackie Chan, Sammo Hung, and Yuan Biao, they revolutionized martial arts on screen. They came from the Seven Little Fortunes opera troupe. Their action was rhythmic, acrobatic.
But the crucial element, the thing that really set it apart, was the danger factor.
They didn't have the same insurance policies that Hollywood had.
Not even close.
No. The stunt work was generally unsafe and often uninsured. When you see a fall in a Hong Kong film from this era, there are rarely safety cables or green screens. The visceral quality comes from the reality of the risk.
And it wasn't just martial arts. John Woo reinvented the gunfight.
The heroic bloodshed genre. Themes like A Better Tomorrow and The Killer. Woo stylized violence, treating gunfights almost like dance numbers. This aesthetic would eventually be imported to Hollywood,
Influencing people like Tarantino and the Wachowskis.
Absolutely. We also saw the girls with guns subgenre emerge.
Stars like Michelle Yeoh and Cynthia Rothrock.
Yes. They established a space for female action stars that was arguably more physically demanding and more central to the narrative than what was available for actresses in Hollywood at the time.
Let's shift gears completely from the violence of action cinema to the drawing boards of animation. The narrative of 1980s animation is a dramatic story of near death and resurrection.
It really is. In the 1970s, animation had drifted. By the 1980s, the Walt Disney Company, the titan of the industry, was in a precarious position. The studio was struggling to find its identity.
This all culminated in 1985 with The Black Cauldron.
The Black Cauldron was a financial disaster. It was expensive, it was dark, and it failed to connect with audiences.
And the failure was so significant that it almost jeopardized the entire animation department.
There were serious discussions within the company about shutting down feature animation at Disney for good.
Imagine a world without Disney animation. That's how close we came.
Yeah.
But they began to claw their way back.
The recovery was slow. The Great Mouse Detective in 1986 was a modest success. It essentially stopped the bleeding.
But the real catalyst for the modern era came from outside the traditional studio pipeline. It came from a collaboration with Steven Spielberg,
Who Framed Roger Rabbit in 1988.
a live-action animation hybrid directed by Robert Zemeckis.
It was a massive critical and commercial success. It proved that animation could still be a blockbuster medium, and it gave the studio the confidence to greenlight the musical format that would define the next decade,
And that led directly to November 1989.
The Little Mermaid. Its release effectively marks the beginning of what we now call the Disney Renaissance. It restored the studio to its former glory.
But Disney wasn't the only game in town. In fact, for a large part of the decade, they were being out-hustled by a former employee, Don Bluth.
Don Bluth had left Disney in 1979, taking a group of animators with him. He believed Disney had lost its way, artistically.
And in the 80s, he proved that independent animation could compete in theaters.
The Secret of NIMH in 1982 was a critical darling. It was darker, more complex than what Disney was doing.
And then he also teamed up with Spielberg.
Correct. They produced An American Tail in 1986 and The Land Before Time in 1988. These films were significant hits. For a brief moment, Bluth was beating Disney at their own game.
Meanwhile, across the ocean, a different kind of animation renaissance was happening. The Japanese anime industry was producing works that would eventually influence global culture.
This is the decade of Hayao Miyazaki. Following his debut in 1979, he released Nausicaa of the Valley of the Wind in 1984.
And the success of that film.
It allowed for the founding of Studio Ghibli.
And the output of Studio Ghibli in the 80s is just remarkable.
It is a run of classics. Castle in the Sky, My Neighbor Totoro, Grave of the Fireflies, and Kiki's Delivery Service. These films offered a depth of storytelling, and an artistic sophistication that was very distinct from the American style.
And we cannot ignore Akira.
Released in 1988, Akira is a landmark film. Its cyberpunk aesthetic and its incredibly high-quality animation budget set a new standard for what anime could look like. It helped open the West to Japanese animation.
And we also saw the start of the Doraemon film series in 1980.
Which became a cultural institution in Japan.
Let's move to the evolution of genre. The 80s was a laboratory for science fiction, fantasy, and horror. In sci-fi, we saw the continuation of the 70s boom, but it split into two directions. You had the light and you had the dark.
The dark side was dominated by post-apocalyptic and dystopian themes. Mad Max 2, or The Road Warrior in the States, defined the aesthetic of the wasteland, the leather, the metal, the road barbarians.
John Carpenter's Escape from New York gave us the cynical anti-hero in a crumbling society.
But the ultimate dystopian vision was Ridley Scott's Blade Runner.
From 1982.
It merged science fiction with film noir. The term tech noir was coined for it. It featured Harrison Ford hunting androids in a rain-soaked, corporate-dominated Los Angeles.
It wasn't a massive hit initially, was it?
No, it wasn't. But visually, it is perhaps the most influential sci-fi film of the entire decade.
On the lighter side, you had the films appealing to the Spielberg generation.
Yes. Back to the Future and its sequels, E.T., and the cinematic expansion of Star Trek.
The Star Trek franchise proved incredibly resilient.
With 4 films released in this decade alone, it successfully transitioned the original television cast to the big screen and found a massive audience.
Then we have the fantasy explosion. The sword and sorcery genre had a massive moment, largely thanks to a certain barbarian.
Conan the Barbarian from 1982. It starred Arnold Schwarzenegger, further cementing his rise. But you have to look at the credits. It was written by Oliver Stone and John Milius.
These are serious, intense filmmakers.
They treated the pulp source material with a level of operatic seriousness that elevated it.
And we also saw the fairy tale fantasy trend, The Never-Ending Story, The Princess Bride, and Labyrinth with David Bowie.
Labyrinth is another example of a film that underperformed financially upon release, but found a massive second life on home video. It speaks to the unique visual creativity of the Jim Henson Company during this period.
Now, horror. If you walked into a video store in the 1980s, the horror section was dominated by one thing.
The slasher film.
The slasher.
The slasher film is the quintessential 80s horror product. It is defined by the unstoppable murder and a significant increase in on-screen gore.
It was an assembly line. Halloween continued its run, and you had the birth of Friday the 13th and A Nightmare on Elm Street.
These franchises were incredibly profitable because they were cheap to make. You didn't need expensive stars. You needed a mask and a creative way to dispatch teenagers.
Michael Myers, Jason Voorhees, and Freddy Krueger became pop culture icons.
They appeared on lunchboxes, in video games, they were brands.
Critics hated them.
They were reviled. Critics like Roger Ebert and Gene Siskel famously campaigned against what they saw as misogynistic women in danger tropes, but the box office returns were undeniable.
But horror wasn't just guys in masks. We also had the creature feature, where practical effects reached their absolute zenith.
John Carpenter's The Thing from 1982 is the benchmark. The practical effects used to create the shape-shifting alien were groundbreaking and, frankly, grotesque.
Still hold up today.
They do. Similarly, David Cronenberg's The Fly from 1986 used body horror to tell a tragic romance.
And we saw the rise of the horror comedy.
Ghostbusters, Gremlins, Beetlejuice. These films took supernatural elements and made them accessible to a mass audience through humor. They were gateway horror films for a younger generation.
Speaking of humor, let's talk about comedy and the teenage experience. The 80s comedy landscape was essentially a graduation party for Saturday Night Live.
The cast of the original SNL migrated to Hollywood and completely dominated the screen. Bill Murray, Chevy Chase, Dan Aykroyd.
And Eddie Murphy.
Eddie Murphy's run in the 80s is historic. He revitalized the action comedy with 48 Acres in 1982 and then carried the Beverly Hills Cop franchise starting in 84. He was arguably the biggest comedy star in the world.
Then you have the spoof genre, perfected by Airplane.
Right.
And you have the teen movie. This genre really belongs to one man. John Hughes.
John Hughes treated the teenage experience with a level of empathy and seriousness that was rare at the time. The Breakfast Club, Ferris Bueller's Day Off, they weren't just comedies. They were sociological snapshots of suburban youth.
But this theme of the rite of passage wasn't limited to high school.
No, it was a thematic through line for the entire decade. We saw it at every age level.
For teens, you had The Karate Kid in 1984, The ultimate underdog story.
For young adults, you had St. Elmo's Fire dealing with post-college anxiety, and Top Gun.
Top Gun is a rite of passage film.
Absolutely. It's essentially a sports movie where the sport is flying fighter jets, but the core arc is a rite of passage from maverick into maturity. Even Flashdance applied this to the working class, a welder striving to become a ballerina.
And for the older demographic.
You had Cocoon, which dealt with the rite of passage into old age and the desire for renewed youth. The Big Chill focused on baby boomers facing their own mortality and lost idealism after the suicide of a friend.
So the industry realized that growing up, no matter your age, was a marketable hook.
It was a hook for every demographic.
We even saw darker takes on the teen movie by the end of the decade, like Heathers in 1988.
A very dark, tongue-in-cheek satire of the Hughes formula.
As we wrap up this analysis, we need to look at the machinery of the industry itself. There were decisions made in the 80s that changed how we watch movies today, specifically the rating system.
The birth of the PG-13 rating.
Before 1984, you just had PG and you had R. There was a massive gap in the middle.
That gap became a serious problem with two films in particular, Indiana Jones and The Temple of Doom and Gremlins. Both were rated PG.
But they were intense. Temple of Doom featured a scene where a man's heart is ripped out of his chest. Gremlins had creatures exploding in microwaves.
Parents took their young children expecting a light adventure and got nightmares.
The backlash was significant.
It was. Steven Spielberg himself, who directed or produced both films, suggested an intermediate rating, so the MPAA created PG-13.
And the first film released with it.
Red Dawn, in August of 1984. This new rating allowed studios to market edgy action and violence directly to teenagers without the commercial death sentence of an R rating.
We also saw the solidification of what you could call sequelitis.
The industry moved away from original properties. If a film worked, a sequel was immediately ordered. Rocky III, Rocky IV, Superman II.
The franchise became the star.
More than the actor or the director, yes.
This brings us to the final question, the critical legacy. Was the 1980s a good decade for film or a bad one?
It remains the subject of intense debate among critics and historians.
On one side, you have the detractors.
Yes. Critics like Kent Jones and filmmakers like Quentin Tarantino view the 80s as the bottom-line era. They argue that the artistic freedom of the 70s was crushed by the corporate mandate for high-concept products.
They see it as the decade where movies became commercials for themselves.
However, there is a strong counterargument. Film theorist David Bordwell suggests that this is a reductive view. He points out that the megapicture mentality had roots in the 70s, as we discussed.
Right.
Furthermore, he argues that the new Hollywood directors, Scorsese, De Palma, Carpenter, they didn't just disappear.
They kept working.
They continued to make masterpieces like Raging Bull, Scarface, and The Thing right alongside the blockbusters.
So the art didn't die. It just had to share the screen with the commerce.
Exactly. The 1980s was a time of coexistence. The studio system reasserted control, yes, but within that system, technical innovation and genre evolution flourished.
So when we look back at the 1980s, we are seeing the blueprint for today. The return to the studio system, the high-concept blockbuster, the explosion of action, the global rise of Asian cinema.
The franchises that were born in that decade, Star Wars, Indiana Jones, Terminator, Ghostbusters, these are the same franchises filling theaters 40 years later.
It was the decade that built the modern movie business. And whether you love the blockbusters or miss the odd tours, you cannot deny the impact. Thanks for listening.